The world is filled with pain and suffering.
Oh, hey again, buddy. You're still eerily looming over me, I see. You wouldn't mind moving back a couple feet, would you? I would feel a lot more comfortable. And maybe I could get up off of my knees?
So how could an all-powerful and all-loving God exist?
If the world is full of pain and suffering? By not knowing about it, I guess?
And if he does exist and yet allows these terrible atrocities to occur in the world, why would we want to worship him?
Are you asking me? Because I don't really have a good answer for you on that. Now, before I go any further here, I want to point out this video originally had really annoying music in the background. Super distracting, just terrible. So I removed that to the best of my ability. If the audio sounds a little weird at any point, that's a byproduct of that. But I think it sounds alright.
Epicurus was a Greek philosopher who lived in the 3rd and 4th century BC. He framed the logical problem of suffering and evil in this way. If God is willing to prevent evil but not able, then he's not all-powerful. If he is able to prevent evil but not willing, then he is not good. But if he is both willing and able, how can evil exist? And if he is neither able nor willing, then why call him God?
Yeah, so roughly that is typically attributed to Epicurus, although there are no sources that confirm that. It's just kind of a thing people say. Now, what should be noticed about this way of stating the problem of evil is that it can immediately be dismissed by just saying, well, if he doesn't know about it, then it doesn't matter how powerful or how willing he is, he's still not going to do it. And that's why for a very, very long time, the third important property has been included of omniscience, being all-knowing. And that makes it more difficult to address.
In other words, according to Epicurus, it is logically impossible for God and suffering to both exist. And yet we know that suffering does exist. Therefore, as the argument goes, God does not exist.
Alright, so this video is called The Problem of Evil in the World, Christian Response. But to be more clear and specific about what the topic really is, it's a discussion of whether the reality of suffering is compatible with the existence of God as believed by Christians. Evil can be a bit of a murky term, and so can suffering, but suffering is at least a lot more clear. It's easy to think of evil as a description of an intentional action. Someone did an evil thing. Some people would infer that as a connotation, but suffering has no connotations like that attached. Without anyone doing anything bad to you on purpose or even accidentally, you can still suffer. And so usually when the problem of evil or the problem of suffering comes up, it's best to focus on natural occurrences, earthquakes, fires, getting struck by lightning, because then all the typical tired apologetics about free will that try to explain away human evil are inapplicable from the start, completely impotent, and then you can stick to the actual point without the Christian tossing in red herrings that don't actually address it.
But does this argument hold water?
To an extent, yeah. It's not really my favorite argument, although I've definitely talked about it a lot because for some reason Christians find it very compelling as something they need to respond to. I think as long as you know that the person you're talking to believes in a God with the relevant properties, then that person typically will find it quite hard to find some way around it. Of course, a lot of them have prepackaged apologetics that they've heard around that they just assume will work well because they're common, I guess. And then a lot of the time, in my experience, they'll just drop that on you and then act like that settles the issue. But a lot of the time, it doesn't even address the issue and just shows that the person hasn't even understood it. Like the free will arguments that I just mentioned. Those are probably the worst because it shows the person doesn't even understand what the topic is.
Let's take a look. Well, first, are these two statements logically inconsistent?
What statements? Suffering exists and an omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent God exists, I assume? A little more specificity would be appreciated, but that's fine.
An example of two logically inconsistent statements is David is a bachelor and David is married. These two statements are logically inconsistent because David can't be both married and a bachelor.
Yes, I know. Look, I commented on this last time I made a response to you. It's weird how you present your video in a tone as if it's for children. You explain things as if to children. You film yourself as if you're talking to children sitting on the floor at your feet. And yet, obviously, there's no kids watching this. Or if they are, they mentally checked out 5 minutes ago and it's only been a minute and a half. The video's for adults, alright? Know your audience, man. Just make your point. Although, I don't know, maybe you're right in thinking your Christian audience needs this explained as if to a child. If that's your figuring, I guess maybe it's not so silly to do it this way.
So let's ask the question, is it possible for an all-loving and all-powerful God.
Dude, oh my god, what happened to Jesus' face? Somebody replaced it with a glowing void. He looks like a monster from a horror game.
Is it possible for an all-loving and all-powerful God to exist in a world where pain and suffering also exist?
Yes. Because if he's all loving and all powerful, but he doesn't know everything, then the suffering exists in the parts he doesn't know about. Why are you starting off addressing a hobbled version of the argument with basically an entire third of it chopped off? If you really wanted to show that this type of argument fails entirely, wouldn't you want to take a strong version of it and destroy that? Otherwise, you're not really making much of a point.
The answer is yes.
I know. I just explained why, but that's not really to your benefit.
You see, hidden inside of these statements are hidden assumptions which need to be brought out. The first assumption is regarding God's power. If God is all-powerful, then the assumption is that he can create any universe that he wants. But can he really?
Okay, interesting that you seem to be disagreeing with that. I'm not going to comment on it yet. I'm going to wait to see what you say about it.
Stay with me now.
Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. Video's not long enough yet, but I'm waiting to dip out as soon as it is. Sorry.
What if God wants a world populated by people who have free will?
Then he'll make a world populated by people who have free will?
It's logically impossible for God to force someone to freely choose to do good.
Okay, but it is logically possible for God to make a universe where people have free will and can freely choose to do whatever they want, but nobody feels suffering. So what does this have to do with the problem of suffering?
Forcing free choices is like making a square circle. It's not logically possible.
You don't mean forcing as in threatening, right? You mean forcing as in operating the person like a remote-controlled car. Yeah, then sure, I agree. Now, God, as documented in the Bible, does have a history of not really caring that much about this people having free will rule. He absolutely will remote control people into doing what he wants if it suits his agenda. Exodus 4:21, 7:3, 9:12, 10:1, 10:20, 10:27, 11:10, 14:4, 14:8, 14:17. Yeah, most of the whole plagues of Egypt part of Exodus is just God remote controlling Egyptians to make them do stuff he doesn't like. And then in the New Testament, you have Romans 9:17 through 20. For the scripture tells Pharaoh, I raised you up for this reason, so that I may display my power in you, and that my name may be proclaimed in the whole earth. So then, he has mercy on whom he wants to have mercy, and he hardens whom he wants to harden. You will say to me, therefore, why then does he still find fault? For who resists his will? On the contrary, who are you, a human being, to talk back to God? Will what is formed say to the one who formed it, why did you make me like this? In other words, yeah, sometimes I'll let you have some free will, but only when I want you to. Now shut up and quit whining, ingrate. Yeah, I don't know, this whole God has to allow free will all the time thing really doesn't hold any water biblically. So I mean, even by his own standard in his own book, he doesn't really have a justification for not stopping people from, like, brutally murdering each other and stuff. Christians love using that as an excuse, and oh, by the way, called it. But even if we accept the idiotic premise you're trying to smuggle in here that human suffering is only ever caused by humans doing things to other humans, this hands-off approach to human action that you're pretending God is real strict about adhering to isn't a thing in the Bible. So the excuse falls completely flat even on its own terms.
However, it's not that God lacks the power to perform the task.
Ooh, now his face is a black void. Now he's dark Jesus.
It's just that the supposed task itself is just nonsense.
Well, the excuse is nonsense. If you want a God that's 100% strict on the idea that humans can only act on free will, but then the Bible outright says he doesn't care about that and he'll just harden whoever's heart he feels like anytime he feels like for any reason he feels like, something doesn't add up. You want it both ways. You want the Bible to be true, but you also want to change God's character and God's wishes to suit your whim whenever you find it convenient to try to win an argument. Sorry, I'm not going to put up with that.
It's like asking if God could make a rock so big that he could not lift it.
No, it's nothing like that whatsoever. Don't be silly.
The question itself is nonsense. The reason it is nonsense, as Dr. Frank Turk explains, to ask, could God make a rock that God could not lift?
Seriously, now we're veering off into an explanation of the omnipotence paradox and the rock? No, absolutely not. You know, I'm willing to put up with a lot of irrelevant tangents in these videos, but this is too much even for me. I'm skipping this. We're getting back on track. Come on, dude, do better.
So it may not be feasible to create a world populated by people who always freely choose to do what is morally good.
Okay, I suppose that's debatable, but there's no reason for me to debate it because it has nothing to do with the argument we're talking about. The argument is not about a conflict between the existence of God, as described, and the existence of a world where people don't do morally good things all the time, meaning where people sometimes do things God disapproves of. That's not the argument. It's not even related to the argument. It doesn't even sound like the argument. Why are you trying to recast it that way? The argument is about suffering, and there's no conflict whatsoever between a world where people are free to make choices, including to act against God's wishes, and a world where nobody suffers. All God would have to do is make people such that they can't suffer, that no matter what happens, their brain simply doesn't send them a signal, this sucks. There are already infinite things you're not capable of, and infinite things your brain doesn't tell you, and this would just be one more. Problem of suffering solved, and you still get to keep all your free will.
So the first assumption is not necessarily true.
Just to remind the audience, the first assumption was that God can create any universe he wants. And aside from all the free will nonsense, the general point was that God can't create a logically inconsistent universe, which is interesting because many Christians will argue that logic comes from God, that God had to create it and make it work the way that it works because he created everything. But no, here we have logic being greater than God, forcing him to make decisions that otherwise he may not choose to make. I don't really have a point with that, it's just kind of interesting.
This means the argument fails.
It's funny because you're saying the argument fails because it's based on a false implicit assumption, but the implicit assumption that you're challenging is that God can create any universe he wants, including logically inconsistent ones, which is not an assumption that's being made, or at least not an assumption that needs to be made. There's no logical inconsistency between removing suffering from a world full of people with free will. If you want to go with God's omnipotence only extends to doing things that are logically possible, and he can only create universes that are logically possible, God is a slave to logic, okay, I'm fine with that. That has zero impact here.
But let's look at the second assumption. The second assumption is that because God is all-loving, it is necessarily true that God would prefer a world without suffering.
Yeah, okay, if you want to just say God wants to hurt people, he wants the world to be full of suffering, he gets his kicks from it, like when Shmuel Paulin said in All In for God that God causes atrocities because it's like watching a movie for him, and he feels like watching a horror movie today, fine, I would say that diffuses this entire thing completely. That's an interesting way to approach it, but yeah, if I thought that that was what you thought about God, I definitely wouldn't be bothering to bring up the problem of suffering. There would be much better avenues of approach at that point. But if that were what you thought about God, I would not be willing to describe that God as all-loving. I think that would be just definitionally false. I think that would violate the definition of what that word means. If you use it in some weird way that allows for things like that, for permitting and causing absolutely brutal suffering to your loved ones, that's not a usage of the word I would recognize. I would suggest that's a strange and novel redefinition that I don't take seriously, and maybe you should choose a different word. Because it seems like you're trying to use the positive connotations of the word love, and psychologically apply their feelings about that word and those connotations to actions that match none of that. It smacks of dishonesty and mind games.
But how can we know this?
What, that an all-loving God would not want his beloved children to suffer? Well, because no loving parent wants their children to suffer. That's the whole point of love. Now, yeah, of course, as a non-omnipotent parent who does not have unlimited power to make things right, you may intentionally put your child through some degree of suffering, nothing major, but some amount of suffering, in an attempt to build that child up such that that child's life will be better later. Yes, that can be a loving act, but the reason that you do that is that it's the best you can do with the power that you have. You and your child both live in a world that you don't control. Your child is going to have certain qualities to cope with that world or fail. And the result of that failure may be much worse suffering than the occasional character-building, toughening experience, or feeling stressed studying for exams. As a loving parent, at the root of everything that you do when you're raising your child, there's the fear and uncertainty about what's going to happen in the future and how you can get your child ready for it. There's the understanding that there are things you can't make right, and things your child may not be able to cope with, which can be exacerbated if you don't put the effort into trying to make your child able to cope with them. So you may subject your child to some small degree of suffering in hopes of mitigating later suffering, but you would never willingly subject your child to avoidable extreme suffering. Not as a loving parent. If you do that, I'm sorry, but you don't meet the definition of being a loving parent. So I would say that's how you know a loving God wouldn't do that, because the loving God doesn't have the fear and uncertainty or the lack of power. Literally, the only reason an all-knowing, all-powerful God would allow its child to suffer is because it just feels like it. There's no actual reason. There's nothing that it's protecting its child from. There's no worse outcome that can occur if it doesn't let its child suffer, unless the God wants that too.
We all know cases where we permit suffering in order to bring about a greater good.
Well, I just got done talking about that. I guess I don't need to address it again. But yeah, there's absolutely no circumstance where God is logically obligated to let you die slowly and painfully in a house fire to bring about some greater good. If he wanted the greater good, he would do the greater good thing. The house fire is purely gratuitous. That's just there to amuse him.
Even things like exercise, lifting weights, surgeries, training processes all involve some sort of pain or suffering, yet produce a greater good.
Yeah, so let's go through that again. Exercise. You exercise because you don't have control over your body. You don't have the power to just make it better. You have to go through a long, grueling process of exercise in order to improve it. This is because you lack all powerfulness, and you really lack very much power at all. Surgeries, well, you're not getting yourself cut open and people groping around inside your guts for the fun of it. If you could just snap your fingers and have it all be fixed, you would. And if it was your child, even more so. If you are putting your child through surgery just for the fun of it, well, then I guess you're a very godly person. Training processes, why do you need training? Because you don't have the power to instantly make yourself know everything. All of your examples only occur because humans lack power. Unless you're going to tell me that God is as impotent as a human, these comparisons are useless.
So if it's even possible that God allows suffering in order to achieve a greater good, then we cannot say this assumption is necessarily true.
To remind everyone, the assumption that he's countering being that an all-loving God would prefer a world without suffering. And the reason, apparently, that all-loving God might prefer a world with suffering is that it allows for a greater good to occur. So the response then is not that allowing your child to suffer pointlessly is consistent with being all-loving. Okay, good. So I think then that we probably agree that this kind of thing would not be consistent with our understanding of what love is. And what you're saying is God is like a parent who's allowing the child to suffer because a greater good will occur. Presumably, less suffering will occur later to compensate, and allowing the suffering right now is the only way to achieve that outcome. Which, as I said before, is the case sometimes with human parents, usually only with mild forms of suffering, because obviously a loving parent typically won't intentionally put their kid through extreme suffering in hopes of some future good outcome. But there are limited cases like that. For example, necessary surgeries, chemotherapy. I think most of those cases will be medical. I can't think of any good examples that aren't. But yeah, loving human parents may sometimes need to permit suffering in hopes of a future greater good. But we're not talking about a human. Let's take the example of the person in the house fire. Let's say that the reason God made that house fire and made you burn alive for 20 minutes in it is that in the course of those 20 minutes, you would give your life to Jesus and end up in heaven. Okay, so if God wanted you to go to heaven anyway, he could have just cut out the middleman, not made you suffer in the fire, and just dragged you up on into heaven. Maybe he wouldn't even have bothered popping your soul into a body on earth at all, and just created it in heaven where he wanted it, and skipped the whole middle step altogether. If you say, but oh no, all human souls are dirty with original sin, and God doesn't want dirty sin souls in heaven. Okay, well, why'd you create them like that, for one thing? But if you really insist on doing that, just give them a wash, and then put them in heaven. We're not talking about a human parent who lacks options, who lacks control over the world. We're talking about God, who has infinite options. If some of his options are logically inconsistent, fine. A lot of them won't be. And this is the point where Christians chime in with, who are you to question God? You don't understand his plans? That suffering really is necessary, and you just don't understand why. It doesn't matter if I understand what the plan is. The point is, the plan isn't necessary. It could be any other plan. The same outcome could be got any other way. If there's some end goal in mind, some final state of reality that's perfect or whatever, an all-powerful God could have just made that. He doesn't require mechanisms to achieve his goal. He doesn't need Deep Thought's Earth computer to give him the question to the answer of life, the universe, and everything. Whatever the goal is, it's right there for the taking anyway, instantly, with zero effort. Anything else, anything other than just making the goal happen, is gratuitous, completely unwarranted. The only explanation for that is that's how he wanted it. All the suffering to get to the goal isn't to achieve the goal, it's just to achieve the suffering.
For the logical problem of suffering to succeed, the atheist would have to show that it's logically impossible that free will exists.
Now, you can have your free will, I don't care. I do, by the way, think it's logically impossible for free will to exist if it's possible for there to be an omniscient God, but that's a different issue. Not getting into that now, I've got into that a million times before. In fact, if I may say so myself, I think I have a really good patron exclusive about that, about the inevitability of a guy eating Fruit Loops for breakfast. Sorry, guy, I feel for you.
For the logical problem of suffering to succeed, the atheist would have to show that it's logically impossible that free will exists, and that it's logically impossible that God has good reasons for permitting suffering.
No, if you want this problem of suffering to fail, you're going to have to show that God has good reasons for permitting suffering in the sense that whatever the superior goal is, it's logically impossible that it could ever be achieved any other way by any possible action that God could possibly take that causes less suffering. You have to show me that your all-powerful God has no better option than to let you burn alive in your house. He's helplessly watching as it happens, going, "Oh no, I wish I could do something, but this is the only way to prevent that much worse thing that I also created." I would say that's a hell of a tall order when you're dealing with an all-powerful, all-knowing God who created and caused literally everything, including the worst outcome he's supposedly trying to avoid.
This is a heavy burden for the atheist to prove.
Look, if I toss out this argument, it's because I think God has options. If you disagree and you think the universe is like predestined to be a certain way, predestined to have you burning in a house fire, whether God likes it or not, I disagree. I think that goes entirely against the entire point of omnipotence. If you disagree, if you want me to think God's omnipotence is so impotent that he can't even prevent someone from burning alive in a fire without increasing the amount of suffering in the world, that's on you, man. You gotta convince me of that. That is a weird as hell claim. That's not something I'm just going to accept just because you said so. All I'm doing is taking your word for it when you say God is all-powerful, and if you want to say he's all-powerful, asterisk, he can only do logically consistent things, fine. I don't see any reason to think it's logically impossible to save anyone from a house fire without increasing the amount of suffering in the world. If you think that is logically impossible, fine, who cares? But if you want me to think it is, you're going to have to provide some actual reason beyond just, I don't know, it might be.
Therefore, it's quite possible that God and suffering both exist.
If you say so. Just keep talking.
This is why philosophers, even atheist philosophers, have given up on the logical problem of evil.
Vague, meaningless appeal to authority. Don't care, keep talking.
But let's go a little further. First, we are not in a position to say with any certainty that God lacks reasons for allowing suffering in the world.
Okay, but you are in a position to say with certainty that God lacks any logically possible alternative? Really? And you really want to have it both ways, don't you?
We as humans are limited in time and space, limited in intelligence and insight.
Yeah, that would be the distinction that makes us allowing some types of suffering sometimes compatible with us being loving. We lack better options, or at least think we do, whether they're logically possible or not. And bizarrely, you seem to be thinking of God in a very similar way, like he's a big human. But that's not the concept.
However, God sees every detail of history from beginning to end and orders it through people's free decisions and actions in order to achieve his purposes.
Oh, wow. That's the biggest statement of the video so far. So, God orders history through people's free decisions and actions. How is that not a contradiction? Either the people act freely and thus order history themselves, or God orders the history through their supposedly free decisions and actions, and thus is basically puppeteering people to make the history he wants. Which is it? Biblically, it's the latter, puppeteering people. I guess you can decide whatever you want. Go with the Bible thing or make up your own thing. You just got done scolding people for a supposed contradiction of God controlling people's free will. And now you're doing the exact same thing, pretending that this is still free will somehow? Come on, practice what you preach. And then you say that the reason that he's ordering history this way, manipulating people's decisions and actions to get the history that he wants, is to achieve his purposes. And I assume this also means that he's putting them through suffering to achieve his purposes. The person suffering in the house fire is suffering to achieve some purpose for God. So when I was talking about the relatively powerless parent causing some small degree of suffering in hopes of protecting the child from future suffering, I was talking about it in the loving context of doing something to make the child's future better. Now, in fairness, maybe that's what you mean. Maybe you mean God lets a person die in a fire to achieve his purpose of avoiding some greater catastrophe for that person. Maybe. It's just that the way you say it, it doesn't really sound like it. I feel like most people, if that's what they meant, they would in some way refer to the betterment of the future of the child. But instead, all you talk about is that God's doing this to get something he wants. I don't know. Obviously, there is a charitable interpretation here. I'll leave it up to the viewers to decide if they think that's the intended one. And finally, you say God has all this power and knowledge. He sees all of history. He's pulling all the strings. But judging by this video, you really don't seem to have thought this through to its implications. If God has some purpose he wants the universe to fulfill, he's God. He can just fulfill his purposes. He doesn't have to follow a bunch of steps like he's putting together IKEA furniture. He can just order it fully built. But maybe that's not the case. Maybe he's powerful, but not that powerful. Maybe every person burned alive in a house fire is like one more turned camlock in the celestial, funnily named bookshelf.
In order to achieve his purposes, God may need to allow a great deal of suffering in order to bring this about.
I will agree if God's purpose is to allow a great deal of suffering.
Suffering which appears pointless within our limited scope of understanding may be seen to have been justly permitted by God within his wider framework.
All right, dude, I'm not seeing it. You haven't given me any reason to think it's logically impossible for God to do stuff without causing massive human suffering. Maybe do that, then we'll talk.
Think about it. Sometimes what we experience makes no sense until we gain a wider perspective and see the big picture designed by the Creator.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. God's not confined to some particular big picture like we are. He designed the big picture to be how he wanted it. He can tweak the picture however he wants. He could have just made a different picture altogether. We're powerless to change that. But the whole point of God is that he's not that.
I am sure you have had times in your life where things didn't work out the way you initially wanted them, but it was a total godsend.
Okay, so stick with me here. God wants to give you a godsend. He wants to make something real good happen for you. Option A, he makes the good thing happen. Option B, he torments you for years and then makes the good thing happen. What is added in option B that's not already present in option A? And what makes option B logically necessary? As in, God has no choice, logically speaking, to not torment you for years first before he does the thing he already apparently wants to do for you. That's the point you should be addressing. You're making these claims to try to counter this problem, like as if that's how it is. But you give nothing to back it up. You just say maybe it's like that. Maybe God just can't do any better. Maybe it's logically impossible. Maybe God's just too impotent. And you just expect that people are going to accept this with no further questions, with no attempt on your part to make it make sense, just because it's your headcanon.
Or maybe you have had times when you pray for something and the prayers do not get answered in the way that you hoped for, but turn out so much better than you could have even thought.
I like how you're taking examples like, something just didn't work out the way you hoped it would, or you prayed and you didn't quite get what you wanted right away, which sure, maybe you could count as mild forms of suffering, but you know that's not the kind of thing we're talking about. Come on. You're trying to steer away from it to make sure you don't say anything that sounds bad.
It is important to understand that God's purpose is not restricted to this life, but spills over beyond the grave into eternal life.
Yeah, I get it. I just talked about the heaven thing. So what? What does that change about any of the points in this video?
This world is just the beginning, the entryway to an unimaginable, never-ending life beyond death's door.
Listen, God might be inflicting massive amounts of completely avoidable suffering upon billions of people, but also there's heaven, though. So, like...
As Dr. William Lane Craig says, Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament, underwent afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, hunger. Yet he wrote, "We do not lose heart."
Yeah, look, I get that the religion makes you not see the problems here. I understand. It's kind of why I'm here. This isn't adding anything. This is just empty Christian prattle.
Paul understood that life on earth and whatever suffering it holds for each of us is temporary.
Not relevant to the argument, not relevant to any point you actually tried to make in response to it. You're basically just changing the subject.
Our pain will not endure forever,
Gigantic asterisk.
but our lives with God will.
Okay, great, whatever. Stick to the point next time. Thank you everybody for enduring that with me. And if you would, before you go, please do give the video a like and click subscribe if you haven't. And if you like the channel, maybe consider supporting. I don't take sponsorships, and so I really appreciate all of my supporters who help me keep doing this. For early access, email list.logicked.com, and I'll see you next time.